The Oregon Trail is often remembered as a road of hardship, broken wagons, river crossings, disease, hunger, exhaustion, and the daily fight to keep moving west. But on the 20th of August, 1854, a small wagon train led by William Alexander Ward, often remembered simply as Alexander Ward, met something far worse near the Boise River. They were nearing Fort Boise, close to one of the major landmarks on the road west, when their journey came to a violent end. By the time the violence ended, nearly the entire Ward party was dead, and one of the deepest scars in Oregon Trail history had been left along the Boise River. What makes the Ward Massacre so haunting is not only its brutality, but how little most people know about it today. It was one of the deadliest settler massacres on the Oregon Trail, yet the surviving record is thin. The accounts vary, the numbers shift, and much of what remains comes from later recollections, old newspaper reports, military accounts, and regional histories shaped by the biases of their time. But enough survives to tell a story of a stolen horse, a deadly confrontation, a desperate defense, 2 wounded boys left for dead, and a tragedy that helped change the Snake River country for years to come. This is the story of the Ward Party Massacre, one of the Oregon Trail's deadliest and most forgotten tragedies. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. Before the Ward family ever reached the Boise River, the Oregon Trail had already been changing for decades. Long before covered wagons moved west in steady streams, much of the route through what is now Idaho had been used by native peoples, fur trappers, traders, missionaries, and pack trains. According to the Idaho State Historical Society, by the 1830s and early 1840s, wagons and immigrant parties were beginning to move through the Snake River country toward Fort Boise. And by 1843, a major migration of roughly 800 people pushed wagons past Fort Boise and over the Blue Mountains toward the Columbia. More followed in 1844, and by 1845, thousands more were on the road west. To those immigrants, the land that would later become Idaho was not the destination. Most were aiming for the green Willamette Valley, far to the west. But to get there, they had to cross the hard country of southern Idaho, the Snake River, dry stretches of trail, scarce grass, dangerous crossings, and long miles that wore down both people and animals. Places like Soda Springs, Salmon Falls, the Snake River crossing near present-day Glens Ferry, and the fur trade post at Fort Hall and Fort Boise became important landmarks along the way. In earlier years, contact between immigrants and native peoples was not always violent. Dave High and Daniel Newcomer, in their article titled The Ward Massacre, described southern Idaho as a place where Shoshone, Paiute, and Bannock people had traded with fur trappers, missionaries, and later wagon trains. Native groups provided food, stock, services, and local knowledge, while immigrants traded goods, animals, and supplies in return. For a time, the Boise Valley was a corridor of trade, as much as it was a road for migration. But as traffic increased, that fragile balance began to break down. By the early 1850s, thousands of immigrants and their animals were passing through the same country year after year. Grass was overgrazed, wood and sagebrush were burned for fuel. Game became harder to find, and disease and suspicion followed the trail. To immigrants, the greatest fear was often attack or the loss of livestock. To native communities, the growing wagon traffic meant the loss of resources, pressure on their land, and strangers moving through in ever larger numbers. By 1854, the Oregon Trail through southern Idaho had become a place where peace and violence existed side by side. One wagon train might trade and move on without trouble. Another might lose animals, accuse native men of theft, or find itself caught in a circle of fear and retaliation. In that world, a single stolen horse or ox could be seen by immigrants as a threat to survival, while native bands may have viewed immigrant livestock as compensation for grass, wood, and game consumed along the route. That was the tense world Alexander Ward's small wagon train entered in August of 1854. They were ordinary immigrants, moving west like thousands before them, trying to reach Fort Boise and eventually the country beyond. But the road had changed, the old fur trade world was fading, the immigrant trail was growing heavier every season, and somewhere along the Boise River, those pressures would erupt into one of the darkest and most brutal attacks in Oregon Trail history. On Sunday, the 20th of August, 1854, Alexander Ward's immigrant train was moving through the Boise Valley along the Oregon Trail. They had come out of Johnson County, Missouri earlier that spring, and according to the account later preserved by Harold Rodenbach in the Idaho Statesman, their journey had been mostly uneventful up to that point. They had crossed hundreds of miles, joined with other wagons, and passed through country where danger was always possible, but no serious trouble had yet come upon them. By late August, they were nearing Fort Boise, one of the major landmarks on the stretch of the trail and a place where immigrants hoped to rest, trade, and prepare for the next difficult miles west. That afternoon, the Ward party turned off the main road toward the Boise River. They were roughly 20 to 25 miles from the area where Boise would later stand, and the purpose was simple: eat, rest, and let the stock graze. It was the kind of ordinary pause every wagon train needed. Animals had to be kept alive, men and women had to gather their strength, and children had to endure the same endless rhythm of dust, heat, hunger, and movement. But while the party was stopped near the river, one of the horses was taken. In William Ward's later account, one of the survivors, his older brother Robert, who had been guarding the cattle, came rushing back into camp and said native men had taken one of the horses. Dave High and Daniel Newcomer described the incident as a spark that ignited the massacre. A horse was stolen, and in the confrontation that followed, a settler had shot the thief down. The Ward party quickly hitched the teams and moved back toward the road, where the country was more open and where they may have believed they had a better chance of defending themselves. But they had barely reached it when they were surrounded by 200 Shoshone and Snake Indians, and from the moment the attack began, the immigrants were badly outnumbered. Alexander Ward, the leader of the little train, was among the first to fall. The men tried to hold the attackers off and protect the wagons, where the women and children had taken shelter, but the fight stretched on for hours with little hope of escape. As the battle continued, the immigrants fought from around the wagons and along the road, trying to keep the attackers back until nearly sundown. The sound carried across the valley: gunfire, shouting, and the panic of people who knew they were trapped. According to William Ward's account, a nearby wagon train camped about 10 miles away, heard the reports of the guns, and men from that train hurried toward the scene to help. But the rescuers were too late to save the Ward party. By the time they arrived, the defense had collapsed. Most of the men had been killed, and the attackers had reached the wagons where the women and children remained. The accounts of what happened after the men fell are some of the hardest part of this story to tell. The later reports describe the women and children being killed in a horrific manner, with bodies burned and beaten after the fighting ended. William Ward said the women and children were, quote, killed and burned in a most horrible manner. Another statement quoted in the 1929 Idaho Statesman article described members of a rescue party finding bodies near the site and along the trail afterward, including Miss Ward and Mrs. White, both badly beaten. These details come through survivor memory, rescue party reports, and later settler accounts, so they should be handled carefully, but every version agrees on the same terrible reality. When the attack ended, nearly the entire Ward party had been destroyed. Two of Alexander Ward's sons, Newton and William, survived by the thinnest margin imaginable. As the attackers reached the wagons, the boys tried to escape toward the brush. Both were struck down by arrows. Newton, about 13 years old, was wounded and knocked down, but remained still and was later found alive by the rescuers. William, who was around 12 or 15 depending on the account, was shot through the left side and lung. He later remembered being ridden over and then losing consciousness. Believed dead, he was left on the ground through the night. When William regained consciousness the next morning, the massacre site was behind him, and survival became his only thought. Weak from blood loss, with the arrow still in his body, he tried to make his way toward Fort Boise. But at the Snake River crossing, confused and badly wounded, he failed to cross where he should have and wandered down the south side of the river instead. Because of that mistake, he missed the immigrants who later returned to gather and bury the dead. He did not reach Fort Boise until the following Saturday, carrying the arrow in his side the entire time, and, by his own account, having nothing to eat. At the fort, H.P. Isaacs of the Dalles and 3 men operating a ferry across the Snake River received him, fed him, and removed the arrow. Meanwhile, the men who reached the massacre site found a scene of devastation. Gerald Badu, writing in Nebraska History, describes how Winfield Scott Ebby's wagon train came upon the place on the 24th of August, just a few days after the attack. Ebby recorded that everything showed signs of a hard struggle. 6 bodies lay by the road, partly covered by earlier passerbys. Blood marked the ground. Tent poles, half-burned feathers, broken objects, and the remains of the fight were scattered around the site. He states, quote, "I picked up a hat with 2 bullet holes in it and saturated with blood. I presume the owner received the ball in the head." Ebby and others stopped, dug graves, and gave the dead what burial they could. Before leaving, he posted a warning for the wagons behind them to be on guard. From that point forward, he wrote, "Every man went armed." In all, 18 members of the Ward Party were killed, along with 1 member of the rescue party who was mortally wounded, bringing the total death toll to 19. Only 2 young boys survived the massacre, William and Newton Ward. But in the days that followed, the Ward massacre became more than one family's tragedy. It became a warning passed from wagon to wagon, a story that hardened fear across the Snake River country, and a turning point in how immigrants and officials viewed the dangerous stretch of the Oregon Trail. News of the massacre created immediate pressure for retaliation. Harold Rodenbaugh, writing in the Idaho Statesman in 1929, quoted older accounts saying the horror of the Ward massacre called for the immediate punishment of the native people in the Boise country. Major Granville O. Haller set out from Fort Dalles with about 60 soldiers and a few civilian volunteers. But by the time he reached the Snake country, the bands believed to be responsible had disappeared into the mountains. Haller could show that the government intended to respond, but he could not bring the campaign to a decisive end that first season. The following summer, according to the same account preserved by Rodenbaugh, Haller returned and captured men identified as the leaders of the massacre. Those men were hanged, though the surviving accounts do not give us a clear investigation showing exactly what evidence was used against them. In the eyes of the military and many immigrants, the executions were meant to answer the bloodshed along the Boise River and send a warning through the Snake country. But they did not bring peace. Instead, the Ward massacre and the retaliation that followed became part of a wider cycle of fear, revenge, and violence along the Oregon Trail. The Idaho State Historical Society later wrote that friction with Native people made the trail more dangerous after the Ward massacre of 1854. Fort Boise and Fort Hall, once important stopping points for immigrants, had to be abandoned, and military escorts were sent out to meet and guard wagon trains through the most dangerous stretches. The problem was that the escort system could not protect everyone. The country was too large, the trail too long, and the immigrant traffic too scattered. That failure became painfully clear in 1860, with the disaster of the Utter Van Ornen Party, a massacre I covered in a previous episode, regarded as the deadliest attack on a wagon train on the Oregon Trail. Like the Ward Party before them, they were immigrants moving through the Snake River country when violence overtook them. To officials, it was another sign that temporary escorts were not enough. The Ward Massacre, the abandonment of Old Fort Boise, later attacks in 1858 and 1859, and the Utter Van Ornen disaster all helped push the United States Army toward establishing a new military post in the region. General George Wright formally recommended a new Fort Boise in 1860, but the Civil War delayed action. Then, when the Boise Basin Gold Rush began in late 1862, the need for a permanent post could no longer be ignored. On the 14th of January 1863, the Secretary of War authorized a new Fort Boise, and Major Pinckney Luganbiel formally located it on the 4th of July 1863, about 40 miles upriver from the old Hudson's Bay Company post. There is a marker placed by the pioneer chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution for the memory of the pioneers who were killed. It is what you are looking at now. The Ward Massacre was not just a story of one wagon train destroyed near the Boise River. It helped change the way immigrants traveled, how officials viewed the Snake country, and how the United States military responded to violence along the Oregon Trail. For the Ward family, it was a catastrophe almost beyond imagination. For those who came after them, it was a warning. And for southern Idaho, it became one of the most violent steps in the transformation from native homeland and immigrant corridor into a permanent American frontier settlement. I hope you all enjoyed this episode on the Ward Party Massacre. If you did, please give a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you get your podcast, please give a 5-star rating and leave a review. I always love hearing from y'all. Join the Wild West Deep Dives family. For just $1, you'll get a membership that gives you access to bonus content like the first stagecoach robbery in US history. Thank you all for the recent support. Y'all are amazing. We will see y'all next time, and remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.